I chose this text from John's Gospel for Easter because it seems to me like the most personal resurrection story, the one that I can feel most like I can be part of. We can hear this passage as a play in two scenes. Some people prefer to gloss over the first scene and concentrate on the second, but I think there's a good reason why we should watch the whole play. And so, scene one, Mary, Peter, and the other disciple. The first several verses of John's Gospel are called the prologue, and there we find, "What has come into being in the Word was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it." All through the fourth Gospel, we see darkness and light dancing together. From the prologue to Nicodemus visiting Jesus at night, and Jesus' claim, "I am the light of the world." So Mary came to the tomb while it was still dark. Perhaps she couldn't wait. The gospel writer doesn't say she brought spices and ointments to anoint Jesus' body, but maybe she knew that Nicodemus had already done that. But she knew that Jesus was no longer alive. She was one of the very few who were there when Jesus died. What a shock it must have been to find the stone rolled away. But she didn't shout, "Christ is risen." She didn't, maybe couldn't, assume that Jesus had been resurrected. Instead, she ran to tell Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. The unnamed disciple was at the foot of the cross with Jesus' mother. Throughout John's Gospel, this disciple, the beloved disciple, is known only that way. Over the years, many have identified this disciple as the Gospel writer, but I'd like to propose another identity. When I raise my hand, I want you to say your first name. The beloved disciple, the one whom Jesus loves, is Paul. Very good. Some of you followed instructions. The two disciples ran to the grave, raised Stephen, and the beloved disciple got there first. Perhaps Peter was still stinging from the shame after his denials, or perhaps the beloved disciple felt a greater motivation to find out what had happened. Whatever reason, the beloved disciple looked into the tomb, but didn't go in. Peter, probably a little bit out of breath, arrived at the tomb and went on in. You might wonder why John includes so many details about the grave cloths and their positions. Some early Christian theologians, like John Chrysostom, explained, if anyone had removed the body, they would not have stripped it first, nor would they have taken the trouble to remove and roll up the sudarium and place it in place by itself. The sudarium is a cloth that is placed over the face of the dead. If you remember from the story when Lazarus was raised, he came out of the tomb with his face wrapped in a cloth. Peter saw all these things, but the writer doesn't tell us how or if he reacted. Then the beloved disciple overcame their reluctance and also went inside. The beloved disciple saw and believed. We don't know what they believed because the author says they did not yet understand the scriptures. Then both disciples left and went home. Did they tell anybody? We don't know. End of scene one. Scene two, Mary Magdalene and Jesus. Now, there's not really a lot of continuity between these two stories here. It's almost like two stories been stuck together, and some commentators like to think that likely they came from different sources. Only the fourth gospel includes this scene and locates the tomb in a garden. Mary is weeping at the tomb, and all by herself. She is the only person at the empty tomb who is common to all four Gospels. Jesus was Mary's beloved teacher and healer, and some suggest even more. Her hope for the Messianic era was cut short, much like life for LGBTQ folks when they are shunned, abused, or killed. Grief doesn't just walk away, so we go to the tomb of what's lost. Grief is what brings Mary and us to this experience. We are not ready to turn our back on what Jesus meant to us. In this reverence and devotion, Jesus won't be dead to her. But with the resurrection, she's not dead to Christ either. She saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. Some suggest that the cloths were transformed into angels. When the 10 Commandments were delivered, God gave specific instructions for the box in which the Israelites would keep them. It had angels at both ends. It was called the Ark of the Covenant, and it was the receptacle containing the Word of God. If you remember the beginning of this gospel, it begins with identifying Christ as the Word. When Mary looks into the tomb, she's not startled. She doesn't even seem surprised. This seems rather odd to me. This is not a hotel where people check out and the maids rush in to clean up the room. She turns around and sees Jesus standing there, but assumes he's the gardener. She asks the same question she had asked the angels. What have you done with his body? It doesn't seem she is expecting news of the resurrection from him either. Was it a mistake to think that Jesus was the gardener? Earlier in the gospel, Jesus had taught a gardening lesson. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Now the gardener has come again. She must not have been paying a lot of attention to the gardener, because she doesn't even recognize Jesus. Suddenly she hears, Mary, only her name. Jesus had said before, the shepherd calls his own sheep by name. They know his voice. Hearing her name, Mary cries out, Rabboni, which means teacher. With this particular name, Mary claims her place as Jesus' rabbinical student. And by telling this story, the gospel writer scandalously breaks tradition and allows women to study with a teacher. Now we can easily imagine Mary running to Jesus to hug him. But Jesus warns, don't cling to me. We may try to hold on to Jesus with our creeds and our confessions, our denominations and our doctrines. But instead, Jesus commands us, go and tell. Jesus' personal word to Mary could not, must not, stay private. But Jesus' words are also for us. I am ascending to my God and your God. Believers are granted the same relationship with God that Jesus has. We are returned to the prologue's promise that all who receive the word are given power to become children of God. So Mary went and told the disciples, I have seen the teacher. She was the first resurrection preacher in the Bible. Now, the standard definition of an apostle is someone who has A, seen the risen Christ, and B, been given a mission by Jesus. So Mary has been appointed the apostle to the apostles. The writer of the Acts passage reminds us that we are to go and tell. To us who are chosen by God as witnesses. And we are to tell that everyone who believes in Christ receives forgiveness for sins. This is not just people who think like you do. This is not just for regular churchgoers. This is not just for white people. And it's certainly not just for straight people. Everyone who believes receives forgiveness. And so we have seen three disciples. One sees the grave clothes neatly folded and believes something. One sees the same thing, and there is no hint that he believes anything. One is startled into believing by hearing the sound of their name. To each and all of these we speak. At one time or another, we find ourselves in each one of them. John could have made this story much simpler. Mary Magdalene, Peter, and the other disciple went to the tomb. They saw the linen wrappings lying there and believed Jesus had risen from the dead. Much simpler, a lot less ink wasted. But rather, John leaves room for each one of us, for one who sees and believes, another who sees and leaves uncertain, and one who needs to hear their own name. Which are you today? There is a new way that Jesus will still be present with us, but also a new way in which Jesus will be absent. The dead are still with us, but in a new way. They are objects of our love, and love still speaks to us. Not just in the words of this book, but because love calls our names. Love calls us to believe and to remember. Love says, go and tell. Amen.